All right, good evening. A couple weeks ago, or whatever it was, when Brandon asked to help teach this class on the wisdom, I said, sure, not a problem. He says, and by the way, I've got you penciled in for Proverbs chapters 25 through 29 through 31. That sounds good. So driving home that evening, I'm thinking, wait a minute, I've not taught from Proverbs before. I've studied it, I've used it in lessons, but I've never taught from it. And then driving on a little further, I realized that's 7 chapters. That's not a lot of time per chapter, so you're going to have to hustle. And then I get to thinking, materials. I don't know that I have a lot of material on Proverbs. So I start digging around and I use 3 versions of the Bible typically when I'm studying. And I like the Truth for Today commentaries. But guess what? It's not out there for Proverbs. Anyway, I found one, Kaufman. Paul Kaufman did a good series on his commentaries. So a lot of what I've thought of or come up with derived from what he came up with. Chapter 25, verse 1. Chapter 25, verse 1 is kind of an interesting. It's neither a proverb, nor was it written by Solomon or one of the others. These also are proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. It was there for a reason. What's that Richard likes to say? Is what's that there for? There's not a therefore at the beginning of this, but why is it here? He gives us a little information about what we're getting ready to see from chapters 25 through 29. If you think about it, King Solomon built the temple, right? He was also there for the United Kingdom. But when you think about King Hezekiah, some 200 years later, and all the debauchery that went on with Judah, Israel, it was actually a divided kingdom. During King Hezekiah's time, also that's about the time that Assyria came in and carried off in captivity the northern tribes. But the interesting thing about King Hezekiah was that he was known for restoring the temple. That is, they decided, he thought it was more important for us to follow God and what he had laid out for us. And in doing so, he had the priests go through and clean the temple. And in cleaning the temple, I'm thinking that they ran across a series of scrolls. And in doing so, they decided it was time to copy those over. You'll find that, as we've seen over our study so far in Proverbs, that it's a parallelism, where the writer will say one thing and give you a picture of it, and then there will be a relationship of how it applies. Verse 4, take away the dross from the silver, and the smith has material for a vessel. I had to look up that word dross. I had a pretty good idea what it was, but it has to do with impurities. You see, when the silversmith takes raw silver out of the ground, he melts it down, there's a natural thing that occurs. The silver is at the bottom, and the dross, the impurities, float to the top. So he could skim it away, and what he's left with is pure silver, which is what he's looking for. He could craft from that. He can make a ring, jewelry, any other materials. But if you look at verse 5, it says, take away the wicked from the presence of the king, and his throne will be established in righteousness. In other words, in a similar fashion, as the silversmith is to remove impurities, the king, with the advisors, he's got all these people in his ear. He has good ones and bad ones. If he listens to the bad ones, guess what? His kingdom won't last. The proper thing to do here, and this is what King Solomon is saying, is listen to the good advice. And from that, your kingdom will survive. You know, I look around the auditorium and I don't know of anyone in here that's ever run a nation. But however, if you think about it, each one of us, you know, we have people in our ear as well also. Do we listen to the good advice or the bad? It's a choice we have to make. Let's come on down to verse 16. I'm going to break this particular verse up a little bit, draw some conclusions from it, and then we'll move on. But if you have found honey, you know, it's interesting, a lot of Old Testament writers used honey in their descriptions. If you think about it, Moses, when he was referring to the promised land, he said it's a land that what? Flows with milk and honey. In Judges chapter 14, we have the account of Samson when he was heading down to Timnah. And what did he do? He ran across a young lion. And he didn't have any weapons to defend himself, but what did he do? He killed the lion with the bare hands. And a couple weeks later, or a little time passes, and he happens back on this carcass. And what does he find in this carcass? Wild bees and what? Honey. Yeah. And what did he do with that honey? He partook of it, right? And he gave some to his parents. Psalms chapter 19, verses 7 through 10. When I was growing up in the youth group, this was actually a song that was sung. The verses were 7, 8, 9, and the chorus was verse 10. If someone has Psalms chapter 19, verses 7 through 10.
The law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true, they are righteous altogether. They are more desirable than gold, yes, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the drippings of the honeycomb.
Wow. Verse 10 sort of kind of sums up what's going on here. It says, more to be desired are these. He's talking about what he just referred to in verses 7 through 9. But more to be desired than what? Gold and honey. Gold is one of those things that gives us value. And honey is something that is delightful, tasteful, yes? But more to be desired are the precepts of what God has for us. It's a truth concerning the will of God. But if we go back to verse 16 again, if you have found honey, eat only enough for you. Why? The end of this verse sort of kind of, there's a word at the end of this verse that sort of kind of makes my stomach turn. Just even thinking about the word, not even the action. If you have found honey, eat only enough for you, lest you have your fill of it and vomit it. You know what that says? Your stomach is taking in this good stuff. And what does it do? It changes gears. It goes in reverse. And when it sends it back, it's not delightful. It's rather sour, acidic. But that's what he's saying. You can have too much of a good thing, right? Well, bear with me as I kind of paint a picture for you here. Many of you know that my dad served in the military in the Air Force, and in doing so, we weren't around our family, our relations, right? So as we moved about the world, or the nation, and he did the world at times, you drew closer to the folks that were there with you. You had families that you drew closer to. And after my parents had been married for about 15 years and had 3 kids, there was a young couple that they come to know and help out. And as with military families, you move here, you move there. But a few years later, we were living in the D.C. area, and my parents got a call, and they said, hey, I'm going to be in a class. I'm going to be studying in an NCO school. Can I come by and see you guys on the weekends? Spend time, stay with you, if you will. Now, this is 6 or 8 weeks we're talking. So for 6 or 8 weekends, he's going to come to the house. It happens to be the fall of the year, and around our house, it's brought up this way, that he and his wife cooked it up, that the week of Thanksgiving, his wife and 2 young kids would come stay at the house as well. Yeah, you see where I'm going, right? Too much of a good thing. But that's where verse 17 comes in. Verse 17, what does it say? Let your foot be seldom in your neighbor's house, lest you have fill of it, and hate you. We didn't actually hate the other family, we did. And I'm glad to say that after many years, those 2 families still remain close, but there is that possibility. Too much of a good thing can and will sour a relationship. Let's come on down to verse 21 and 22 of chapter 25. If you guys have comments, you can go ahead and stop me whenever you need to. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. For you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. You guys have heard that before, haven't you? Right? Romans chapter 12. When Paul was talking to the Romans, the first part of the chapter, he's talking about a relationship between Christians and how that relationship works. A little bit further down in the chapter, he's talking about the relationship with us and the world around us. It could be our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers, maybe even family members that are not Christians. And we have a relationship there. But eventually he talks about folks that will truly oppose us as Christians, actually be foes to us, mean, ugly-spirited to us. If someone has Romans chapter 12, verses 17 through 21.
Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Right. Thank you. So you see here the proverb from Solomon, how Paul used it in the New Testament, how he referenced it, how it fit in. That sort of kind of gives us a better feel for what he's saying here. The Lord's basically saying, look, don't take vengeance out on anyone. That's for me. All right? That's for me. Let it go. But Paul says what? In contrast, not contrary to what God said, but in contrast, what you can do is this. Think about it like this. If you have two people that are against each other, foes, and they're, for whatever reason, they can't seem to get along, and like in a boxing match, you have punches and you have counter punches, right? And so you're both on the defensive. But what does Paul say here? As your punch, instead of being a punch, what if you hit them with kindness? You know what you've just done? You've rendered them defenseless. They have no recourse for that, right? That's what he's saying here. What was that? Hey, Christian.
It's a mic drop moment.
I'm telling you. Well, I'm not Stetson Bennett, by the way.
Yeah, on what you said there, I always think about this particular teaching and think that it's a step past turning the other cheek. You know, whenever you are having to endure something, you know, God's word calls you to turn the other cheek, but you don't just have to sit there and take it. And I think that sometimes as Christians, we just think to ourselves, well, you know, man, how much I'd like to turn their cheek, but, you know, instead of just taking it or just refraining from turning their cheek, you have the opportunity also to, as you said, to treat them with kindness and do something positive, turn your reaction into positive action.
Exactly, so. Right. Other thoughts? All right. Chapter 26. I was talking earlier about King Hezekiah's men and copying out the Proverbs, if you will. In chapter 26, they did a pretty good job. Verses 1 through 12 is actually devoted to fools. And we've had a number of discussions on that, so I won't dig into it as much. But verses 13 through 16 deals with the slothful or the lazy. And Randy hit that up pretty good last week, so I won't settle in on that. But the third grouping is a group that we all, you know what? It's those that are busybodies. Don't you just love a good busybody? Verse 20 through 22. For lack of wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no whisper, quarreling ceases. As charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a quarrelsome man for kindling strife. The words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels. They go down into their parts of the body. What he's talking about here is malicious gossip. You know, you have two parties that are going at it, and there seems to be a mutual friend. And one of them will bend the ear of that mutual friend and give them a bit of information. Not even the whole, just what they know. Hopefully trying to tear down the other person. You know, when we were growing up, there was a game that we played. You would sit around in a circle, and one person would say something to another person, and they would say it to another, and eventually it would come full circle. Well, you know, it never came back the way it went out, did it? There would be something added to it, something that was taken away. Maybe someone embellished on it. But put gossip in that chain, what happens? There's the ability to tear people down, to be ugly, and to be quite hurtful. And you know, as it went around the circle, talk about gossip, isn't that like adding fuel to a fire? Yeah. You know, ultimately, in the long run, all three of these people are going to be hurt by this thing. That's the sad part about it. But notice verse 22, what Solomon is saying here. He's saying, you know what? If there's no one to listen, that ember, that bit of information doesn't get anywhere. It ceases right there. So in a sense, he's saying to the one who is listening, if you didn't even listen, guess what? That gossip would have died right there. Thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking this kind of hits close to home. You know, for lack of wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no whisper or quarreling ceases. You know, with this fire behind our house, you know, there's a Facebook group. It's like 4.6 thousand people from the community that are in it, and we've tried to encourage and bring, you know, communication, you know, for that. You know, this passage fits both with the physical fire that's going on. If a wood is taken off of it, it goes out. But the amount of frustration and things like that, man, just trying to get communication positively, man, it's, you could apply this if you add one comment. If you click enter, if you don't click enter, the fire will go out.
Exactly.
So there's another way to look at it, I guess, in the modern world.
Yes, sir. Exactly. You're right. I mean, you know what? This is the common way of doing it, but there's so many different ways that we in this world, you know, lifetime have the ability to pass good and bad information. Others? Did I see a hand? No. Chapter 27, verse 1. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you will not know what a day may bring. If someone has James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17.
Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin.
Right. You know, it's true that in this life we do things. We go to work and we accomplish it and whatnot. But that's not the problem here. The problem is thinking highly of yourself for doing such. You know, there's not one thing in this world that any of us have that did not originate with God. In a sense, we're not giving credit where credit is due. If we don't recognize God and what we do, our accomplishments, they may flourish for a bit, but we as a person will fail. Because, you see, then we've forgotten where our goal is. Our goal is heaven, right? But think a little bit more with me on this. He says, what is your life but a vapor? It vanishes. He says, if the Lord wills. That's where we need to be putting our emphasis. Recognizing that it's not just us at stake here doing something. And this brought to mind a parable by Jesus of the rich fool. If someone has Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 21.
Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, does not your soul be required of you? Then whose will these things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.
Right. That goes back to exactly what we were saying. Put your thoughts somewhere elsewhere in heaven. But you know what? He also says one other thing here. He uses the word fool. You know, that's something that Solomon used often. You know, sometimes when those around Jesus would mess up or not, you know, maybe they would slip a little bit, what would he say? Oh, ye of little faith. But he didn't use that here, did he? He used something a lot stronger. He referred to him as fool. That can't be a good thing. Thoughts? Verses 5 and 6. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Profuse are the kisses of an enemy. You know, in life, oftentimes we're going to be jockeying for position. It could be at work. You know, we're trying to get a position or move ahead at the company. Or even when we were growing up, if you were playing baseball, you wanted to be the first baseman, and there was another kid there vying for that same position, you know? You always seem to be trying to vie for something. But in this case, think about it like this. If you make a mistake in life, and I don't know, it could be that you say something out of character or you do something out of character, the person that you're jockeying with will say, it's a failure on his part, right? A failure on your part is a win on his part. At least that's the way he's thinking, right? But what will a friend say to you when you messed up? He'll pull you aside, will he not? And he'll say, come on, man. You got to pull it together. You got to do better than this. You know better than this. You know, a couple weeks ago, Chad was saying something about constructive criticism. None of us like to hear it, do we? You know, when we mess up, we know we messed up. But sometimes when someone reminds you of it, isn't it hurtful? But you know what? It's the best thing for you at that moment. You know, it may take you a minute or two to recognize it, but it's the best thing for you to be able to pull back and think about what's going on. Verse 19, and this is one that I like. Yes, sir. Right.
But not all the time does it happen, right? You want to kind of be better than your siblings, and trying to teach your kids at even this young age that it's okay to embrace success for each other.
Right.
Kind of like what you're saying, as friends do friends. But to see the kids argue with each other and like get upset when they do good and they do bad, and like teaching them, even through Bible Bowl questions and things that kids do, just revel in each other's success and be able to be there for someone.
Exactly.
Like that.
Thank you. Others?
Dan, if we can back up just a little, and as I go through and read the Bible, I underline things. If you back up to chapter 26, and I know there's so many to cover, and they're so wonderful, each and every one of them, but verse 17, he that passeth by and meddleth with strife belonging not to him is like one that taketh a dog by the ears or a tiger by the tail. I mean, there's nothing that can be gained in that. I'm not saying somebody that's needing help or advice or something like that. They're talking about strife.
Right, right.
You get in the middle of something that doesn't belong to you. It could be. And one other, down to 19 in verse 26 as well. So is the man that deceiveth his neighbor and saith, Am not I in sport? And I've seen this even in the church where people, foolish jesting, they say, and they really are hurtful to people, and then they say, I'm just kidding.
Mm-hmm.
You're too sensitive. Well, they're not kidding.
They're not, yeah.
They're not. And it's hurtful. And then lastly, and you see this so much in the Bible, verse 27 Proverbs 26, whoso diggeth a pit shall fall therein, and he that rolleth a stone, it will return upon him.
Right.
Just like Haman, when he built the gallows for Mordecai. He was the one that was hanged on it. And there's so many examples of that. And you can read through the Psalms, and there's numerous examples of those kind of things. You lay a trap for somebody, you're the one that falls into
You
it.
could be the one that falls.
That's right.
It's interesting you say that, because I had actually looked at that, a couple of those verses, but in 27, when it's talking about rolling a stone, it had to do with warfare. You would roll a stone up the hill, and guess what? it may fall back on you as circumstances. So going back to what you're saying, be careful with what you wish for, because it could come back on you. Or what you wish for others could come back on you. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, sir. Chapter 27, verse 19. This is one I actually liked. And as in water, face reflects face. So the heart of man reflects the man. When Chad was speaking a couple weeks ago, he used the Jungle Book and the Lion King. And Jerry and I were in the control room, and we sort of kind of giggled at each other because he looked at me and says, "You're not going to be able to use that, are you?" I said, "Well, I already knew then. I already had an idea in mind." So Jerry, this one's for you. In the Lion King, Simba was, he had run away from his past, right? It was behind him. And somewhere along the way, Rafiki, the advisor, caught up with him. And he was running him around in circles. And it was during the evening sometime. And he had run across and he ran him into this thick underbrush. And at some point he said, "Stop, look down." And what he was looking at was a calm water with a moonlight coming off of it. And what did he do? He saw his reflection. Actually, he didn't see his reflection. He saw the reflection of his father in him. The face he had was reflecting his father. It was a reminder that he had not done away with his past. It was still there with him. So Rafiki hits the water and says, "Look harder." In other words, look inside. When you or I look in the mirror, we're looking to see, does my face look right? Am my hair combed? The ladies may be looking to say, do I have my makeup on right? But what you're actually seeing in the mirror is the way people see you. You ever heard the phrase, "Just look in his eyes"? You can see it in his eyes. Or it's written all over his face, right? Yeah, people will see that. If you're sad, it's on your face. If you're happy, if you're anxious, right? But what are they seeing? What's the reflection that they're actually seeing? What's in here? That's what's being reflected. A verse came to mind, or a thought came to mind from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And here Paul was talking to the Corinthians about how they were misusing the way that they were partaking of the Lord's Supper. He had condemned them initially, restated how you should take it. But he uses a word, a phrase, "Let a person examine himself." He was talking about how they partake of the Lord's Supper, but it applies here as well. In our daily lives, we need to look at ourselves. How is the world seeing us? Is there something we have going on inside that we need to, maybe stop, think, reflect? Thoughts? Time's getting away from me, by the way, so Randy, I'm probably not going to complete. Chapter 28, verse 13. Whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes will obtain mercy. In life as we go along, invariably, not on purpose or what have you, but we're going to hurt somebody. We're going to do something that's going to be wrong. And there's two ways that we could handle this. We can ignore it and hopefully it'll pass by, or we can confront it. You know what? Seeking forgiveness, it's not easy, is it? You see, you got to recognize that you caused somebody else pain. You've also got to recognize that you've got to humble yourselves, to bring yourself lower, recognizing it, and seek that person's, "Look, I'm sorry, I messed up here." And you got to, if you don't do that, that relationship will strain.
I was thinking too, whoever conceals his transgression will not prosper. And if you think about that, it doesn't prosper anyone. When I think there is an idea that
I've got to look perfect. I've got to be perfect. If you let anything out, then that's the worst thing that could be. And to the point that how you doing? Oh, I'm fine. You can't even reveal anything. And so I remember I've gone to go to the CASA meetings, and what I love is going around the room. The first thing you say, I've said I'm a sinner saved by grace. And everyone shares the struggles that they've faced. And I tell you, it is such an encouragement because we're all in that same boat. Maybe not with the same situations, but we're all sinners falling short of the glory of God, and it's Christ that builds us back.
Right.
And, if we conceal these things, and we're only fooling ourselves.
True. Thanks, sir. Other thoughts? In chapter 28, there's a couple of verses, verse 12, 28, and then chapter 29, verse 2. Just kind of follow along with how this one kind of flows. Verse 12, when the righteous triumph, there is great glory. But when the wicked rise, people hide themselves. Verse 28, when the wicked rise, people hide themselves. But when they perish, the righteous increase. Chapter 29 and 2, when the righteous increase, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan. It's kind of interesting how all those were linked together. Dealing with the wicked. It's a sad thing that we look forward to a time when they'll perish. Really? Because we want what? We want relief. We want peace. The other thing that I found interesting here, like I said, I used 3 versions. The last phrase in chapter 29 and verse 2 says, the people groan in the ESV. In the King James Version, it says the people mourn. And in the American Standard Version, it says the people sigh. It's 3 variations, very different variations of the same word or same idea, is it not? When you sigh, right? But when you groan, aren't you grumbling and talking amongst people? And when you mourn, will this guy ever leave us alone? Those were all different, weren't they? It's interesting. How could they have interpreted it in such a way? Thoughts?
Well, you get Russia and Ukraine. With one man.
Just look at the groaning of 2 nations over war. And so, that's really all I want to say, when it comes to that. And you can look at history when one man stands up and makes decisions. When he falls, wars cease. World War II, for instance.
Right.
It's the Proverbs play out in all of this.
Yep, it's true. The interesting thing about when Hitler and his regime passed, guess what? The German people still suffered for a time. It was lasting. They finally did get back on their feet, but you know what? At that point, they were under 2 rules of 2 other nations, the East and the West. They were in for a difficult time. Time-wise, I'm going to hit this last verse here, and I could already tell I'm going to be far from what I intended. Verse 15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Oftentimes, what we've seen so far in the Proverbs is that a child will bring shame to his father or will bring gladness to his father. But in this case, he refers to the mother. When you're raising kids, it takes both, mom and dad. They both have their roles. They both have their abilities on how to handle the kids in certain situations. But in this case, he refers to mom. And mom oftentimes is the one that rears the kids. She gets them up in the morning gets them up, gets them dressed, gets them fed, gets them off to school. They come home. She ensures that their homework's done, their bed is made, so forth and so on. But kids are going to what? They're going to push that envelope. They're going to see where they can reach to those boundaries. And you've seen it, and we're talking toddlers at this case even. You've seen a toddler sitting in his high chair there, got his bowl of oatmeal or cereal, and mom's in the room with him. And when she leaves, what's he do? He looks around, and next thing he knows, And mom comes back and, what happened? No, mom knows. Mom knows. Or think about it. You've heard this phrase, don't touch the stove. Invariably, what they going to do? Touch the stove. Yeah. Or Bob comes home, I'm going over to Johnny's house after school. I'll be back in time for dinner. Well, it gets about dinner time. Bob's not back home. Mom calls Johnny's house. Is Bob over there? No. Johnny is, though. Mom knows. When Bob gets home, there's trouble.
We see this in our culture right now. We've got a lot of parents that don't necessarily discipline very well their children. They want to be their buddy instead of being their parent.
Right.
And it's amazing to listen to Jessica as she's teaching over at JCA. There's a lot of great kids, but there's obviously a discipline issue. They don't really get disciplined like they should. Nope. And as parents, we have to look at our kids. I've got 2 girls. They're total opposite ends of the spectrum.
Right.
One's quiet and reserved, one's just like her daddy that gets in trouble. But I can tell you and I've told this story many times, we used to have this console that would have your TV in one and you had your components in the other behind the glass door. When Jess was a little girl, a little toddler, she'd walk up to that glass and she'd pop it and I'd look at her and say, you better go, and she was gone. Jess, or Cheyenne on the other hand, just like her daddy, would go up to that door and bang, and I'd say, sweetheart, you better leave it alone. And she'd turn, look straight at me and go bang, bang, bang. But we as parents have to determine what's the best way to discipline.
Right.
Jess didn't need much. She just needed to know that, hey, we weren't happy with it and she was gone.
Right.
Cheyenne, on the other hand, I couldn't count the spankings. But we see that in our culture now based on all those parents
right.
that do not really discipline.
Going to add to what you're saying there about culture-wise, we're not doing these kids any favors if we don't discipline, because when they get out in the workforce, they're going to struggle. And what are they going to do?
I know we don't have enough time to get to chapter 30, but 30 is essentially kind of like what Stan's saying. Like, we're seeing chapter 30 kind of play out in our society. When you get halfway through it, it talks about the eyes that mock his father and scorns obedience of his mother. The ravens of the valley will pick it out, and the young eagles will eat it out. It talks about how the youth, for not being disciplined, will just take for granted the customs of their elders. And going on down, it gets to where we're at verse 20 of 30. This is the way of the adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done no wickedness. It's like, I don't know about that. And that's like our society today. It's like, I've done nothing wrong. It's like, you've done a lot of wrong, but we just don't call you out.
It's funny, you brought out verses 15 and 17 of chapter 30, and that's one of the ones that I had picked out to engage in. We're out of time, but I do want to hit this real quick. Chapter 31. You've heard it called the godly woman or the worthy woman, right? Don't know the writer. It's credited to King Lemuel, but there's not a person that we know of King Lemuel. It could be a pet name that his mother had given him. Here again, we don't really know. But it's an extremely beautiful passage. It talks about a woman who takes pride, ownership in her home. In other words, it's not just that she cleans and does this or that. It's hers, and she knows it, and she takes care of it. It could be her husband, it could be her kids, it could be the house, it could be any of that stuff. And she really takes pride in ownership of it. But an interesting verse there, verse 30, part of it says, a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. You guys may have heard this. I've not been to a wedding, a funeral of which this is actually read. But it describes a woman in a great sense. It's interesting that in a book of wisdom, this is brought out. Y'all been good tonight? Appreciate it. Thank you for your comments. I knew I had a lot more material. I knew I would have more material than time, but I was hoping to be able to knock through it. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful to have this evening to come here and to learn from your word, to open up what it means to listen to someone who is wise. Pray, Father, that we will learn from those things that were said, apply them to our lives so that we can be that light in the world that we come in contact with. Thank you for your Son who came to this earth, showed us how we should live our lives. Pray, Father, that we will strive to be like him, choose, make good choices in life. Watch over us this day and the remainder of our lives. In Christ's name I pray, amen.